I'm Jerry Green, and I'm the president and CEO of the Pacific Council on International Policy in Los Angeles. I'm very pleased to welcome all of you to our event, What Does America Owe to Veterans of its 21st Century Wars? We are especially proud and pleased to be partnering with Zócalo Public Square, which is truly the jewel in the crown of many of the public events here in Los Angeles, as well as the U.S. Veterans Artists Alliance, to present this conversation to you. The Pacific Council is an international affairs organization focused on the global role of Los Angeles, which is arguably the most global city in the world. And if you are interested in learning more about the Pacific Council, please feel free to visit our website, pacificcouncil.org, for information about our upcoming events and membership. I want to thank all of you. You're in for a wonderful discussion, and I would like to turn it over to Maurice R, who's the Executive Director of Zócalo Public Square. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry, for the high praise. And hello, everyone. My name is Moira Shuri. Welcome to Zócalo Public Square, a creative unit of Arizona State University. At Zócalo, our mission is to connect people to ideas and to one another. We publish original writing and convene events. Everything we do is free and everyone is welcome. Find out more on our website, zocalopublicsquare.org. And now I have the really hard task of trying to summarize the work of today's moderator, Emma Skye. She is the director of Yale University's Maurice Greenberg World Fellows Program and a senior fellow at the Jackson Institute, where she teaches Middle East politics. She has advised U.S. forces and NATO leaders in Iraq and Afghanistan. She has written a book and numerous articles that have been published in the New York Times, Politico, The Atlantic, The Guardian, and Slate. And she is also an officer of the British Empire. Over to you, Emma.
My name is Emma Skye, and I'm really excited to be speaking today with Steve Miska. Steve is the Executive Director of First Amendment Voice, a nonpartisan effort working to build civic awareness around First Amendment issues. He recently retired from the military after 25 years of service, where he also served as Director for Iraq on the National Security Council. Now, I first met Steve in Baghdad in 2007, and he stood out because of his wonderful manners and because he cared deeply about Iraqis. He was humble and kind, not the first attributes that you typically associate with men in uniform. But what I didn't know at the time was that he was establishing an underground railroad to get dozens of interpreters out of Baghdad to Oman and on to the United States. And he chronicles that experience in his new book, Baghdad Underground Railroad, Saving American Allies in Iraq. Steve, it's great to see you.
Emma, it's always a pleasure to join you. Thank you so much for joining me in this conversation.
So Steve, take us back to 2007 when we first met and explain what was going on in Baghdad and what led you to start smuggling Iraqi interpreters out of Iraq.
First, let me also thank Zócalo for hosting this, and Jerry Green and the Pacific Council on International Policy. They've been supporting the policy work that I brought that burning issue back from Iraq with me and for years now. And then lastly, the U.S. Veteran Artists Alliance as well. They've been wonderful in helping coach me along the writing process, as they do for many veteran writers and artists. So it's just wonderful to be a part of their team. The 2006 and 7, as you recall, was the height of sectarian violence in Iraq. And at that time, we were seeing over 3,000 deaths a month, which is essentially, for our American audience, a 9/11 every month. It was traumatic for the society. It was essentially a civil war. And anybody working alongside Americans was targeted. I mean, it was lethal for us, but it was really lethal for them. There were Shia militia, Sunni insurgents, Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Everybody wanted to kill the folks who were collaborating with Americans. And so it was really dangerous.
Well, you know, you've written about this in your book, and really congratulations on the book. It is a great read. I really, really enjoyed it. And most books on Iraq tend to focus on the US military, but your focus is actually on Iraqi interpreters. Who did you write this book for?
So, yeah, I actually resisted writing the book, as you're probably aware, since you were one of the people who kept encouraging me to write it, because I didn't want it to be about me. I didn't want to just tell a memoir, but people kept saying, you need to tell the story of the Underground Railroad. You need to tell how we helped Iraqis escape, how dangerous it was for them, but also what it was like for them when they arrived in the United States. And so the last third of the book is very much in the United States, with the courageous women, mainly, who opened up their doors and welcomed these young Iraqi men into their homes and helped them get established in a very foreign environment. So I wrote it in many ways for the characters in the book, for the sponsors, for the interpreters who were able to escape. But also, I think it's more broad than a veteran audience. It's more broad than another military story about war. It's an American story. It's a human story at the end of the day, trying to maintain our humanity amidst extreme violence. And so that's who I wrote the book for.
Well, President Biden has announced that all US troops will be withdrawn from Afghanistan before the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks this September. But many Americans have already forgotten about the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq and just want to put that behind them. Why should Americans care about the fate of those who interpreted for US troops?
I think, Emma, this gets directly to the theme of today's event. You know, what does America owe her veterans? We serve by an ethos of leave nobody behind. And we tend to think of that as those of us in uniform, that we're deploying together and serving next to each other. And then we meet people like you, and you're there, and we wouldn't leave you behind, right? You came in from Britain, and we worked closely alongside each other, but we also meet our Iraqi and our Afghan partners. And these are men and women who go on patrol with us every day. They share more risk in many cases than we do, because their families are in the mix. Their families are, that many times they can't let their families know what they do for fear that somebody would inadvertently slip to the wrong ears, and then all of a sudden they're receiving death threats at their door. A family member is getting kidnapped and held for ransom. And those things are very real threats. That interpreters, there are plenty of cases where interpreters have been kidnapped, tortured, and killed, and done so in a very public way to send a message to anybody else who might think about working alongside of us. So this is an issue that is strongly resonating in veteran and military communities, that we don't want to violate this ethos that the military inculcated in us. And I believe that the American public can very much help if we are able to get our, say, Afghan interpreters out as we're withdrawing, because we need the same sponsors that I chronicle in the book. My mom was one of them. Madonna, a widow from Tucson, was one of them, with her only son deployed to combat. We need the American people to embrace the Iraqi or Afghan families if they're fortunate enough to get here. And that is something that, you know, I don't think the American public has been asked to do a lot in these conflicts. Well, the veteran community right now is asking Americans for help. And this would be a huge way to wrap your arms around both us as well as Iraqis and Afghans.
Now, to many people in Afghanistan and Iraqis, the interpreters are regarded as agents, as collaborators with an occupying power. You know many interpreters. What were their motives for helping the coalition forces?
I get this question a lot, and it's really complex, quite frankly. It's the first answer is, what are your motives for taking a position, or my motives? You know, there's a variety of factors. So we don't want to simplify it and try to boil it down to one particular thing. But I think it also ebbs and flows based on the security situation. And so you've got early on in the conflicts, I think hope was a real driving factor, hope to be a part of renewing their country in many ways, post-Saddam, for example. There were, Ronnie, who's one of the main characters in the book, who's also listening today, and is just a wonderful friend. We've stayed in touch over the years and collaborate in other ways. But, he joined up when he was 16, 17 years old, right out of high school, and served the entire time, even as it got risky. And so I think, hope might have been a driving factor early on. Maybe it became more of a need to survive, because now once you've committed to the occupation, I guess, if you will, then it's hard to get away from that and to hide that from the nefarious actors who are out there. So I think, but that said, I'll give you an example in Ronnie's case in particular. He got approved in 2007 for the special immigrant visa. Iraqis at that time, there were only 500 visas available for both Iraq and Afghanistan. That was a pittance in terms of how many people were working with us. So if you got approved for it, you felt like you won the lottery. It was just, and the first instinct was not to believe it was true, right? It must be a rumor. It can't be true. I don't want to get my hopes up because they've been dashed so many times. But he came up to me and he said, sir, I really want to thank you for everything you've done, but I'm not going to the United States yet. And I thought he was crazy. I said, it's really dangerous for you to stay here. And he said, I don't want to go to America and have to depend on anybody. I want to be self-sufficient when I get there. So I'm going to save up enough money so that I can then move there and be on my own. And so anyway, he did that eventually, but there were lots of fits and starts. And 2 years later, he was still in Iraq and finally made it out of there. But it was, there were many crazy stories in between that conversation and actually making it to the US and meeting his American mom, Madonna.
Do you have any idea of how many interpreters have been killed? How many have fled? How many got out to the US? How many still want to come? What sort of numbers are we talking about? So
these are difficult numbers to get on the killed, wounded, fled side there. And part of the reason is because the way we go to war now is with government contractors. And so there are layers of bureaucracy in there that precludes us from getting good statistics. I've actually been trying to crack this nut for about a decade now. And legislatively, defense contractors are required to report to the Department of Labor any statistics that they would for an American that they hire. So, for example, lost work hours, injuries on the job, death, all of those are required to be provided to the Department of Labor, which displays the information they receive publicly on their website. However, that information is almost unusable from a researcher perspective. We can't parse the data in ways that allow us to make meaningful policy. So we're still working in that space. I'm working with some of the organizations that that work with defense contractors in order to help us there. But it's just very difficult. In terms of how many have arrived, the last figures I saw, I believe, for say Afghans, for example, in the CRS 2020 report was 18,000 interpreters over the course of 20 years, and they represent an additional 45,000 family members who have arrived. Currently, there are over 18,000 in the backlog for the special immigrant visa in Afghanistan, and they represent 70,000 family members. And so we're talking a huge number. It's not huge from a historical perspective because we have done this before, but it's a logistical effort that we need to get on top of quickly because the window of opportunity is closing.
Are you worried that in a way, by helping interpreters get to the US, you're actually accelerating the brain drain, enabling the most capable, who really should be dedicating their energies to their country, to actually leave it?
You know, that argument comes up quite frequently, and my counter to that is they're no good to their country if they're dead. They will not. These are people who the Taliban are mercilessly hunting. They have been hunting them for the entire 20 years we've been in country. The Taliban direct their fighters to shoot the eyes first. And by eyes, they mean our cultural eyes, ears, and mouthpieces, our interpreters. They know how vital they are to the mission. And many times they save our lives. Many times they keep us from doing culturally stupid things. I'll give you another example. When Ronnie first started as an interpreter, one of the first incidents that occurred was an armored vehicle accidentally backed up over an Iraqi civilian car with a family in it. So tragedy. And the lieutenant who was in charge of that armored vehicle went to Ronnie and he told him, I need you to go to the hospital with me. We're going to give a salatial payment, blood money, we called it, to the family to acknowledge their loss and to express our condolences. And Ronnie had to back that lieutenant down from the ledge and say, do not do this. We can do it, but not at the hospital, not right now. He said, let's wait until the family gets home in the privacy of their home so they can save face. They're not in a public environment. We'll still go in. It's going to be hard. It's a horrible thing to have to address, but let's do it in a way that's culturally appropriate. And we just don't know what is culturally appropriate as Americans. And so that's why our interpreters are so vital and why we need to stand by them, because they stood by us for 20 years in Afghanistan.
Now, I've heard you say, and I've seen you write, that if the US abandons these interpreters, doesn't help them, the US will not be perceived as a loyal or reliable ally. But playing the devil's advocate here, I'd say, it's not going to be the first time, is it? There are many people who say US isn't reliable. You can ask the Vietnamese, ask the Kurds of Syria, ask the Syrian opposition.
Yeah. So the public narrative, right, is one that is very much based on our values, and values are important in our national security, but so is security, so are economic interests. And it's rare when all of those actually coalesce around one issue. Usually there are trade-offs in that space. I would argue this is one of the times when our values clearly align with our national security interests in important ways, and that we should stand by those who stood by us. And we might not always get it right away, but we did evacuate 130,000 Vietnamese in 1975, and we took them to Guam. and brought them into the United States. And the Vietnamese community has become a vital part of areas in the country and contribute to our economic interests from within as well. So, yeah, I think, historically, this is something that we should expect, and we've got to counter it and be prepared for it and live by our values. And I think this is what the veteran community is asking of our government right now. And I don't think it's a hard ask. I think it's one where we just need to get our priorities straight and bring the right people here.
So in total, it's 7,036 Americans who lost their lives in the post 9/11 wars of Iraq and Afghanistan. So we've been fighting without winning for 20 years. And you could say that's in large part because the mission kept morphing, and so our definition of winning kept changing. And we weren't set clear, achievable objectives. Instead, we were given these grandiose goals of nation building, installing democracy, promoting women's rights, and defeating terror. So these wars became endless because we never knew when the job was done, nor what success should look like. And as you know, we won every battle, but none of the battles were decisive in terms of the outcome of the war. We were militarily superior with overwhelming weaponry, but we were up against enemies using asymmetric tactics, such as improvised explosive devices, hidden in roads, houses, and even dead donkeys. But I don't think any of us who were involved in these wars would have imagined when we embarked on them that the Iraq War would bring about the rise of ISIS and the establishment of caliphate and change the regional balance of power in Iran's favor, nor that the Afghan war would end with the Taliban poised to come back to power potentially. So the costs have been very high, particularly to the locals of these countries, maybe up to 1 million of whom have lost their lives. So do you think that maybe the determination of you and your fellow veterans to help the interpreters who risked their lives for the US troops is driven, I don't know, by guilt, by a type of penance, because this is something we could actually do and do right?
So there's a lot to unpack there. Well, I think you're talking about, none of us would have imagined how long this would take, how the mission would evolve, the mission creep, as we would call it in the military. And I think there's some causal factors there with respect to our defense industrial complex and the vested interest that we have, that our firms have in many of these conflicts, and members of Congress who have bases and jobs are created by those firms that have allowed this to perpetuate in ways that might not have happened at least as long when we had a draft as well, where we had, the vast majority of society involved in the conflict, or at least concerned about loved ones who might be involved in the conflict. And so we've progressed, 50 years now beyond the draft almost. And the military has become very professional, and there is a civil military gap that scholars talk about. And we veterans and those in uniform are concerned about that. How do we know our American people better? How do they know us and have better lines of communication to hold our elected leaders more accountable? And so from that perspective, I think, it's not a great answer probably for how did we get to where we are, but it's some of my thinking along those lines. With respect to, is this a penance for I think it's very much part of the ethos that we learned in the military, that ethos of leave no one behind. And we don't, when I go to Capitol Hill to talk to members or their staff about extending the special immigrant visa, I talk about real national security interests with respect to our men and women in harm's way right now. They're serving alongside interpreters. How is that relationship going to develop when they see what is going on in Afghanistan? If we leave 18,000 interpreters to their death with the Taliban, I don't think we have 2 years, which we had before the fall of Saigon. We've got months, if not weeks, and the veteran community does not want to see our Afghan partners left behind, and we're still facing challenges in Iraq. But there are other real national security interests at stake. Our counterterrorism investigations. Anytime a bomb goes off anywhere in the world, FBI agents and others are there to investigate and understand trends to hopefully protect the homeland better. Who's going to want to talk to one of our investigators and provide vital intelligence if they see how we treat those who served alongside of us for years? And then lastly, a real consideration that policymakers need to take into account is that our young men and women feel like they're violating their ethos when they take off the uniform because of this issue. And is that how we want them to leave their time in service, feeling like they couldn't live up to their own ethos, feeling ashamed of their country? And what are they going to say to the young kids back in their high school, back at home? I mean, how are we going to attract more people into the service? So those are real concerns that we need to be aware of. And I don't think there might be some guilt in there. That's absolutely true, but it's guilt because we're being precluded from being able to try to honor something that we really believe in. That's at least my perspective of why that is. And let me give you a vignette from Great Britain. So this should not be, it's not rocket science that our enemies use these strategies against us. They target what I call our soft networks. They go after our cultural eyes, ears, and mouthpieces. It's a logical thing to do, fighting from a position of weakness. We did it to the British 200 years ago during the American Revolution. To their credit, when they withdrew from the colonies, they evacuated 60 to 70,000 loyalists who had been under intimidation from the revolutionaries. And they went to Jamaica, they went to Nova Scotia, they went back to London. So that was a way, as one parliamentarian I read, I can't remember his name, he said, it was a way to salvage a bit of dignity from a strategic defeat. And so I really believe that, this is a case where we need to stand up for our values and stand by those who stood by us, because in many cases they saved our lives and we owe it to them.
And the British government announced yesterday that it would be providing visas for the Afghan interpreters who worked alongside British troops. What is the policy that you are urging the Biden administration to take?
We are asking for an evacuation to Guam or a third territory like Guam, where we can just get the interpreters out of harm's way. The Taliban are closing in. They're surrounding the provincial capitals. They're surrounding Kabul. There are 70,000 people at least at risk right now because of their work alongside American forces. And the reason we know that figure is because those are the ones who have applied for the special immigrant visa. It's a long, cumbersome process. Many times it takes years. They are the most highly vetted refugees in any system. And we don't have years. We don't have months right now. We've got weeks, and we need to get them to safety, because it won't matter. They've been being hunted and killed for 20 years. If they're dead, we can't help them. And so evacuate them. And then I'm working with a group that is a consortium of nonprofits and other veteran service organizations and other groups to come together to complement the government resettlement agencies that have been, they've lost resources in recent years, but also they haven't done this in 20 years. I mean, we evacuated the Vietnamese in 1975. We did Kosovo in, I think, 99, and the Kurds in 96. So it's 20 plus years since we've done something on a large scale. And so we need to be prepared, and we'll augment the resettlement agencies with sponsors like my mom, with like sponsors like Madonna, sponsors like Leah, who I chronicle in the book, just these amazingly courageous people who we need to be part of this solution. And so that's what I'm asking the American public. I'm sorry.
You're calling for an immediate evacuation of interpreters to the island of Guam. Now, are these people whose applications are already underway, or these are starting afresh?
They are in the system somewhere, a lengthy, bureaucratic, arduous system. And so, yes, there might be others out there who have not made the attempt yet. It's just to leave it up to them to do this. I faced the same thing in Iraq. In 2007, the US had a policy. They would not allow Iraqis to do their final interview at Embassy Baghdad. They cited security concerns. I could imagine we could get to that point soon in Afghanistan. If that happens, where are they going to go? How are they going to get there? We need to get them out of Afghanistan now to a safe third territory. A US territory is ideal because it eliminates a lot of other diplomacy that needs to happen and be negotiated, and potential legal challenges as well. So
is there capacity on Guam to host 70,000 refugees?
Absolutely. Absolutely. They have been preparing. The bottom line is Guam is a tourist destination. They haven't had a lot of tourists in the last year or so. And so there's capacity there. I'm not saying this is something that can be done easily. It requires hard work, both by our government organizations, by the defense contractors that support them, that they would be involved in this, as well as by our society that we're asking for help from. The groups like Mary's List and No One Left Behind will need assistance. The church groups that agreed to sponsor an Afghan family will probably need assistance. My mom's entire community got involved in the family that came together, not just her church, but the community writ large, the schools and the medical facilities that aren't quite equipped for somebody showing up with 5 Iraqi kids in an SUV to get all their shots, so they're ready to go to 3 different schools. And so it's complex. It's not easy. What I would say for those of you out there in the audience that I'm scaring right now, every one of those sponsors I've talked to said it was hard and they would absolutely do it again. It was one of the most meaningful things that they've ever done in their lives. And I think, quite frankly, that's why a lot of the team that was involved in the Underground Railroad, we had tough times. We had the dark hours that haunt you in your nightmares. But because we also have an example of when we saved lives, when we did good, a tangible, concrete example, I think that's helping a lot of us deal with whatever post-conflict challenges we might have. And we can do this as a country.
And your book, in wonderful detail, describes these, Iraqis coming into the lives of Americans. And it really does show the best side of America, the generosity, how all the different civil society organizations work. And, you read that and it's very, very moving. So if you can get interpreters to Guam, in Guam, they will then have their applications processed. And from then they'll be able to move to the mainland. That's the idea.
Correct.
And to different parts of the country where NGOs will be responsible for helping their integration.
Correct. Yeah, we have 9 government resettlement agencies in throughout the country. They have different chapters and areas where some are stronger than others, and they're involved. But we also have had, in the post 9/11 era, nonprofits come in to fill the gaps in some of those spaces and really provide the connective tissue to our societies in many ways, and get people involved in helping somebody who's coming from a cash-based society get a driver's license, start to establish a credit rating, get their kids enrolled in school, or apply for a job, how to write a resume, all of the basics that we tend to take for granted that we help our high school graduates and college graduates with, just because we've got families and groups of neighbors who are willing to help. And so we can do this. This is something that is absolutely doable. It's that part of the book you talk about becomes more of a soap opera in many ways. There are funny examples. I am the first to admit I had no idea what I was asking my mother or any of those sponsors to do and how hard it would be. But they all say at the end of the day, it was so meaningful, and there are a lot of fond memories as a result.
You know, I can attest that navigating the American system isn't easy, and I wish I'd had your help for the DMV. So, you know, having people who really do understand how everything works is really necessary, because it's hard. You know, it can't be easy for interpreters. You know,
Yeah.
at one level, they're very happy to get there, but it's hard to build a new life. Can you share some examples of this?
Sure. Yeah. Number one, I mean, many of them felt torn. They felt like they were leaving their culture. They were leaving their families in many cases behind, because their families were safe, because they had never disclosed to their family what they actually did, that they worked with the Americans. So when they got here, yeah, the DMV it's a challenge for us, right, as Americans. So I can't imagine what it was like for you coming from Britain. And but I did get an earful when I did the interviews for the book, and I talked to sponsors and just listened to their stories and asked them for, follow-up questions, just trying to understand why we do what we do culturally is really challenging. It's, and so we get into details like that, why we use paper plates sometimes at the dinner table and not real plates. And for a couple of weeks after my mom, who got home and said, please, I'm too tired, I'm traveling, I'm going to cook, but we're just going to use paper plates. Well, a couple of weeks after that, my stepdad was still picking out real plates from the trash, because the Iraqis thought these crazy Americans are so wealthy, they just throw all their stuff away when they're done with it. And, silverware, glasses, it was all in there. And so examples like that we learn from, but there's just real richness from the interaction as well, and learning that goes both ways. And I think at the end of the day, it just makes us better human beings.
So we're getting questions coming in from the audience. Someone asks, how does a person go about beginning the process of sponsoring one of these interpreters?
That's a good question. I would volunteer with or connect with organizations that do that type of stuff. So, for example, if you're in the LA area, Miri's List is a wonderful nonprofit in LA. Miri has been doing amazing work, bringing communities together, sponsors for Afghan families and Syrian families as well. I'm not sure how many Iraqi families she has, but she's done amazing work. No One Left Behind has done great work in chapters around the country. There are other organizations out there that are doing similar work to help on the assimilation front. So I would reach out to them. The other area that IRAP, the International Refugee Assistance Project, which is amazing, and they do the legal work. They represent and advocate for vulnerable refugees. If you're stuck, if whoever you're trying to help, a lot of veterans ask this question. I've been in touch with my Afghan interpreter. I don't know what to do. I don't understand the process at all. They don't understand the process. IRAP is the first organization to go to in that step, because they're lawyers, they're operating in the humanitarian space. And if they have the capacity to bring on a case, they do a wonderful job. They're first class. And then the last organization I would highlight would be Veterans for American Ideals, is a program of Human Rights First. And VFAI is a veteran organization that is very passionate about this issue, but they might have demand signals coming up. They'll very, very much be involved in any process to help with sponsorship. So they're another organization you could reach out to and find online.
And there are veterans listening in, and they're asking, how can they help?
Well, if you know of interpreters who you served alongside, the best thing to do is check in with them. One of the most important things is just for them to know that somebody is out there advocating on behalf of them. And many times veterans end up going to their member of Congress and raising the issue of, you're trying to help an interpreter from Iraq, from Afghanistan, from wherever you served, and you need help. And members of Congress, this has wide bipartisan support in Congress, which I know is very unusual nowadays. There are Republicans, Democrats, a lot of consensus around this issue. And Congress, quite frankly, is one of the few institutions that has done anything about this over the years. They passed the special immigrant visa in 2006 and then began expanding it in 2007 and beyond. Unfortunately, the SIV only applies to Afghans today. It twilighted in Iraq in 2014. And so interpreters who had applied before 2014 are still somewhere stuck in the process. But if they did not apply, they need to use some other refugee channel. And that can be a challenge. They might need to get outside of Iraq in order to apply for refugee status. So there's some levels of complication there, but I would definitely refer veterans to Veterans for American Ideals and touch base there. They do a lot of great grassroots work across the country with their membership. And you can plug in with other veterans who are passionate about this issue and get involved that way.
So one of the audience says, you mentioned that the way we go to war now is with government contractors. Yet those contractors are not considered veterans. Do Americans owe them anything?
That's a great question. Many of them, as the questioner probably knows, are veterans. Many times they leave their time in service and go to work for the government contractors. And so legally, our international laws apply different in that space. It's a very gray area, I would tell you. Many of them, they're at the discretion of their firm's insurance policies and individual firm stipulations in many cases. So that is, the individuals choosing which firms they go to based on that is important. I would tell you that the International Stability Operations Association is very active in the government contracting community to help develop smarter policy for the firms, to generate awareness in that space, to allow them to understand the threats as they evolve, to better support their government mission as it develops. So there's a lot of work in that space by the veteran community, but it is a challenge. I have attended funerals for civilians, basically, who have been killed in combat, and they don't get the same honors, if you will, as members of the military do in uniform. And I think that's a problem for us as Americans. I think the fact that we venerate our veterans and hold them on a pedestal is not helpful or healthy to the national discourse in many cases. And that's part of that civil military gap that I alluded to earlier. It's maybe we don't know how to communicate with our vets. And so we just say, thank you for your service as the automatic response, but we're a little scared to dig deeper. And so anyway, a lot of veterans are attempting to, I guess, deepen our relationships with mainstream America more.
So what does your organization First Amendment Voice do, and how does that relate to helping interpreters?
So First Amendment Voice is a nonpartisan nonprofit in the First Amendment space, and that's a very complex space. It's only less than 1% of Americans can name all 5 freedoms in the First Amendment. So the founding fathers were pretty concise, 45 words, and they took care of freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to assemble, or as we might say, hold a protest, and freedom to petition the government for grievance. Those are the 5 that are in the First Amendment. And it's a very dynamic space with the changing technology in terms of how we consume our information, how we express ourselves, how we assemble, whether it be online, virtually, or in person. This forum is a perfect example. So my background is foreign policy, but I was doing foreign policy work for a nonprofit in DC, and they asked me to help them with this First Amendment project they were working on. And I said, I think you've got the wrong guy. I don't know anything about domestic politics. And they said, no, we just want leadership from you. You don't need to be the subject matter expert you're not a lawyer. We do have lawyers on our board, some of whom have litigated First Amendment issues to the Supreme Court. But they wanted me there to help be the face of the organization and broaden our ability to convene civil discourse opportunities, to bridge divides, to educate, but ultimately to inspire us that our form of government only works with an active citizenry, citizens who are engaged, and that can be messy and sometimes ugly, but our message is to encourage us to engage in a civil way and to do it with those with whom we disagree with.
So one member of the audience says that they are worried that the political system that we have has, created policy paralysis, and that's hurting American competitiveness. So how do we make our system more competitive, inclusive, and resilient?
So, yeah, I think there's been a lot of attention, and this definitely isn't a space that I would consider myself well versed in, but in terms of my colleagues who are political scientists and social scientists who study this space, the executive branch of our government has grown extremely strong in many ways, has grown at the expense of the other branches, and there's a bit of imbalance there. And so I guess my gut instinct would say, and this might horrify some people, but maybe reinvigorate Congress's power and authority. They tend to have the lowest approval rating in our society right now, but that would be a way to check executive authority and maybe rebalance our government. We intentionally designed our government to be inefficient. That was the reason there are checks and balances, the reason why we have three supposedly co-equal branches, in order to not allow any one individual to accumulate too much power, to allow the competition of interests to play out non-violently in the public square. And so that's I love that question, because I think it's a question we should all be asking, and it starts with our own personal involvement, though, our not being willing to think that we can't have a role to play, or we can't make an impact in that conversation. We all should be able to voice ourselves, not just, every 2 or 4 years at the ballot box, but through active civic engagement, through participation at the local, state, or national level, at whatever makes sense for our own talents.
And that does relate back to what you're asking the American public when it comes to interpreters. You're asking for them to, be aware, to lobby, to get engaged, to sponsor, all of those things.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I'm not asking the American public to make the evacuation decision for President Biden, right? Although I hope they would
to lobby for it.
Exactly. But then we all have a role to play. That's exactly right. And don't discount that. Don't, think that, well, I don't have a role to play, which is, I think, a very common human characteristic, is we kind of discount our ability to really influence things. And I learned that early on when somebody gave me a second chance to go back and teach at West Point. And I thought, wow, I was a really bad student when I was there the first time. This is a chance to maybe go back and push myself a little bit intellectually.
Well, I'm sure a lot of our audience are listening to you speak and listening to your passion and listening to your experiences and thinking, what are you going to do next? And when are you going to run for election?
Well, if somebody asked that in the audience, my question back to them is, why would you wish that on my family? Haven't we sacrificed enough? I got approached, and actually, Emma, I believe you were one of probably a handful of people who tried to encourage me to run for Congress when I retired. I don't think that's where my talents lie. Well, when I go to Capitol Hill many times, and you can ask my research assistants who would hold my hand as we walked in the door, and I would say, who are we going to see? And they'd say, Congress member so-and-so. And I would ask, are they a Republican or a Democrat? And I just didn't get involved in the legislative strategy. It's not where my talents lie. And so what I'm going to continue to do is, in this area in particular, continue working on the effort to strategically protect our soft networks. We know our adversaries are going to fight this way because we did it. We've seen it throughout history. It has happened to us for the last 20 years. It should not surprise us that they'll target our soft networks, our interpreters and local national partners in conflict zones. We can do a better job of instilling awareness of not just our military, but government contractors, diplomats, and others who are going into the field, and training them on how to protect identity, training them what to do should your close local national partner come under threat. What are the policy options? We shouldn't just have a special immigrant visa, which we only have for Afghanistan anyway. That should very much be a policy of last resort, but it should not be the only tool we have in the kit bag. We can do better than that. And so I'm working in that policy space and attempting to get our government to drive a policy development process that the academic institutions that have been thinking about it can contribute the creativity and capacity for, but to very much do a better job of doing that. So that's in this space. And then, of course, with First Amendment Voice, we're trying to get it to stand on its own as a very new nonprofit. We're grateful to our institutional sponsor, but we really want to continue to develop that. And everybody, when they come to me about First Amendment Voice, they say, this is so timely. we need more of this. And so we're going to continue to do that. We've got a lot of programming up on our YouTube channel, similar to probably how this will be produced today. And I would recommend just go check us out.
Well, Steve, do not undersell your talents, because you'll be a fantastic politician with your integrity, with your intellect. We need more people like you going into politics and going into government.
Thanks, Emma. My wife has threatened me two things now since we retired. Well, actually, it's even before I retired. But she's definitely taken away my Iraq card, because I spent 40 months in Iraq, and lots of people have tried to get me to go to the Kurdish region, to Baghdad, to wherever, to help with whatever. And I am more scared of a woman named Amy than I am of ISIS. So I agreed I will not go back to Iraq. She tried to expand that to the broader Middle East, and I put my foot down there. I've been back to the Middle East since then, but not to Iraq. Maybe someday I'll convince her to come around. But and then the other thing was, at least for the time being, since we did relocate to California for our children, I'm not allowed to go work in DC. So I end up visiting, like I am now. I'm in DC right now. I end up visiting about every other month. It might be a little bit more with the book tour and everything, but I don't think I can do that. Maybe down the road, maybe a few years more.
Well, for those listening in, if you have enjoyed this conversation with Steve, then I really urge you to get his book. It is a fantastic read. Baghdad Underground Railroad, I couldn't put it down. And you will hear, when you read it, you will hear Steve's voice. So go and buy it and think what you can do to help interpreters. Steve has highlighted ways to sponsor, ways to get involved, ways to lobby. There's something that each one of us can do to help push that cause. Steve, a final word from you.
You wrapped it up really well, Emma. I would just say other ways to help our sponsor organizations. They're very much involved in this space in many ways. Zócalo, the public square, they're getting messages out like they are here, but the Pacific Council has been instrumental on the policy development side, and they're always looking for interested members, as well as USVAA that has, I think they're doing a lot of great work for the veteran community, particularly those who want to express ourselves, whether it be through writing a book or becoming a screenwriter, or the cover art was done by an Air Force veteran in South Carolina, and she did an amazing job. USVAA supports all of that. So those are other ways that the audience can get involved.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. So I want to thank you, Steve, for this really great conversation today. And I want to thank Zócalo Public Square, the Pacific Council, the US Veterans Artists Alliance, and to everyone in our audience for listening in. This video will stay public online, and you'll be able to find a summary of our talk, plus interviews with Steve on Zócalo's website, zocalopublicsquare.org. So thank you all, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Emma.